here to talk about physician-assisted suicide. My opponents are arguing that all terminally ill American citizens should have the rights of physician-assisted suicide. The points made were A, that terminally ill patients want to die because they're less able to engage and they have lost their autonomy. Medical bills can be very expensive. Every person has the right to choose. Okay, so first, and he also claimed that the system that Oregon has in place, the Death with Dignity Act, is actually very safe and regulates very well who can and cannot receive physician-assisted suicide. Okay, so the Death with Dignity Act states that in order to participate, a patient must be 18 years of age, a resident of Oregon, capable of making and communicating healthcare decisions for him/herself, and is diagnosed with a terminal illness that will lead to death within 6 months. However, I'm here to talk about how, even though these criteria are set in place, the Oregon system has many flaws and isn't capable of actually regulating who gets it. So first, we have doctor shopping. According to a quote found on Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, it's become common knowledge in Oregon that if your doctor says no, call the main organization that supports assisted suicide. Today it's called Compassion and Choices, but it used to be known as Hemlock Society. Will refer you to assisted suicide-friendly doctors that have been involved in between 75 and 90% of Oregon's reported assisted suicides. Shopping for another doctor who will say yes, you will get around the law's weak safeguards. Now, on the same site, an example of this was that a patient, Katie Cheney, who was 85 years old, her doctor refused to prescribe lethal drugs because he thought the request actually resulted from pressure by her adult daughter who felt burdened with caregiving. So the family found another doctor, and Ms. Cheney soon used the lethal prescription and died. So she used doctor shopping. Another is the data. So on a Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, they found that the state of Oregon has acknowledged that after each annual report is published, the underlying data is destroyed, so no outside party can conduct objective research. So part of the Death with Dignity Act states that if your physician finds you to be depressed and assumes that that's the reason why you want to commit physician-assisted suicide, it's their job to tell you no. However, an example in Oregon, Michael Freeland obtained a legal prescription in Oregon despite a 43-year history of severe depression, suicide attempts, and paranoia. His prescribing doctor said a psychologist consult was not necessary, yet when finally provided high-quality medical and social services, his desire for assisted suicide vanished. He was able to reconcile with his estranged daughter and live 2 years post-diagnosis. So that's just an example of how these supposed regulations that the Death with Dignity Act in Oregon is supposed to follow, they don't actually follow them at all. And then he claims that it's expensive, right? And that the medical bills required for keeping you alive once you're terminally ill cost a lot of money. So first off, I found on the Death with Dignity site, setting up a system like this requires establishing administrative rules and policies, setting up the reporting and data system, preparing forms and instructions, establishing and conveying advisory committees, conducting data analysis, preparing reports, answering media questions, setting up and posting documents on the web, and consulting with the Department of Justice for additional costs. So all of these things are actually very expensive. And according to Emmanuel Ezekiel, he found that the roughly 6% of Medicare patients who die each year do make up a large portion of Medicare costs, 27 to 38%. But this figure has not changed significantly in decades. And if you focus in on Americans, not just older people who die in every year, but every American, less than 1% of the population account for much less of the total healthcare spending, just 10 to 12%. So of the total healthcare spending, the people who die every year only account for 10 to 12%. And according to the Death with Dignity Act, during the year 2016, the rate of Death with Dignity Act people who died was 37.2 per 10,000 total deaths. So not only do you have a low amount of people dying every year accounting for the healthcare spending, but you have an even lower amount who would actually opt for the Death with Dignity Act. So it will not actually save any money. Plus, if you take into account the Death with Dignity Act, it raises a lot of questions, such as, will insurances cover the prescriptions necessary for choosing physician-assisted suicide, or will the patient have to make up that cost on their own? And then if the patient has to make up that cost on their own, then physician-assisted suicide is even more expensive. Now, physician-assisted suicide isn't necessary because there are already alternatives to physician-assisted suicide, such as hospice care. Hospice care is designed to give supportive care to people in the final phase of terminal illness and focus on comfort and quality of life rather than cure. The goal is to enable patients to be comfortable and free of pain so that they live each day as fully as possible. Aggressive methods of pain control may be used. Hospice programs are generally home-based, but they sometimes provide services away from home in freestanding facilities in nursing homes or within hospitals. And then you also have palliative care. Palliative care is actually different than hospice care. It doesn't serve only the dying. Instead, it focuses more broadly on improving life and providing comfort to people of all ages with serious, chronic, and life-threatening illnesses. So we have these other systems in place, and I found a quote from Alternatives to Euthanasia by the Life Resource Charitable Trust that said, "Those experienced in hospice care say that the greatest fear of dying is not physical pain, but the fear of being abandoned by either family, society, or both." So the problem isn't necessarily that these people are actually so unhappy that they want to die, it's just that they're a fear that they're going to be a burden. So on that same website, I found another quote from a hospice worker that went, "Once a patient feels welcome and not a burden to others, once his pain is controlled and other symptoms have been at least reduced to manageable portions, then the cry for euthanasia disappears." So euthanasia isn't necessary at all. And as far as euthanasia being a choice, it's not a choice. Because if you argue autonomy, the argument for autonomy is valid, and if it is valid and can really stand on its own, then one would have to argue that any anonymous individual at any time has the right to die and has the right to speak up. And it's not a truly autonomous act since it involves at least one other person, a physician, and as Lee stated, 2 other witnesses and someone to be present when you take the lethal and prescription drugs. So it's not actually an individual choice.